basically, what this, I think, illustrates is the larger sort of culture that, that chimps have. Again, culture being historically thought of in the West as a human thing, right? But I know that, you know, we've seen, you've seen, I've heard about, friendships, you know, defending the weaker among the group, social hierarchies.
Coalitions.
Yeah, coalitions, political tactics in general.
Certainly.
Tool use, cooperation, conflict. Basically, the foundations of any society are present in their own way. Again, it's a difference of degree rather than kind among these groups. What does that tell us in terms of sort of the complexity of their world?
I think it tells us a lot about the complexity of their world. There's a lot of argument as to what it tells us about the complexity of our own. It depends on who you ask, what social scientist you're talking to. But as far as the complexity of their own world, I think it does highlight that they can maybe provide, you don't ever want to say another animal is a model for our own behavior, but it gives us a lot of insight as to how complex and social they really are. And I think that that can lead to a deeper understanding of their behavior on multiple levels. Franz is well known for being able to take that and apply it to human behavior. This doesn't mean, you know, this doesn't mean that everything is always right in step, but yeah, it's one of those things where you learn a lot more about, from observing them. Some of the stuff that we do is one-on-one, so sitting down with them, and I brought some clips to show you all afterwards. But when you sit back and watch from a distance, you see how complex what they're doing really is. And sometimes it is looking at the eye movement and looking what they do. It's not always so completely obvious. You have to look at how their behaviors over time. Anytime we were going to sit down and do a long observation, it was at least 90 minutes, so that we could really get a suite of behaviors. And sometimes they just want to sleep for a long time, and you're just watching a bunch of chimpanzees sleep and yawn, and that makes you sleep. Dozing off in the tower, and not a good place to sleep. But so I'm not sure if that answers your question directly, but
yeah, I mean, I actually have some follow-up questions. I know that you've done some computer modeling as well with yawn contagion in chimpanzees, and you can explain that in a moment. But that seems to have very direct implications in terms of this concept of mimicry, which, from everything I've read, seems to be at the center of empathy. And you know, that's the trait that sort of, I guess, displays empathic tendencies in animals. So if a yawn is contagious among chimpanzees, that actually tells us quite a bit, if I'm not mistaken.
that's true. The research indicates that we have these very base level contagious behaviors. Yawning is the most obvious example. This isn't my area of expertise, but I did work with a researcher who it was, and so I designed an experiment where we were trying to show if the animals would be able to see images of other types of similar looking things to chimpanzees yawn, and if they would yawn in contagion to that. Usually when I talk about yawning, people start to yawn. It's really contagious.
When I read about yawning in this book,
You don't even think about it.
I was yawning the whole way. By the way, this is the book by Franz de Waal, who we've been talking about. It's called The Bonobo and the Atheist. It's his newest book, subtitle In Search of Humanism Among the Primates. Fascinating book. I think certainly a candidate for a book club selection. And in this book, the basic sort of thread going through is that chimps and bonobos, which we'll talk about, and the difference between the two, are empathic. And there's this basically morality that exists within them. And that morality itself is something that's very innate, that we're not taught, that's sort of, it comes with our DNA, it comes with our hormones and these sorts of things. That's a very broad thing. You can take it wherever you wish.
Sure. I think that Franz has described it as, he wouldn't describe chimpanzees as moral beings, but he would say that we can look at their behavior and the behavior of many other mammals, going down to rodents and see, or across to rodents, and see that empathy is something that is a highly adaptive trait for living creatures. To have have some sort of awareness of the other's condition and to be able to translate that. And even going back to what you said a little bit before about mimicry, which is quite often called imitation, learning from other animals what they do. So chimpanzees in the wild are learning to crack nuts with specific tools that they've kind of found on the ground that might be specific to that group. Their infants will watch them for years how to do it. They'll watch what their mother is doing. They'll watch her cracking open nuts. And this is very important for them. They're not just eating peanuts because they're bored. This is part of their protein intake. They need this. And so that translates into, I am watching what my mother does. They don't actively teach in the same way that we do. I usually try to also talk about ways in which we are different. We don't see them saying, now come here, little one, I'm going to show you how to crack nuts. It's more about having them nearby and the observation and the watching the knowledgeable individuals. And many of our experiments have reflected that, we've been able to replicate that in the captive chimpanzee populations, watching them learn from each other, which involves perspective taking. So
that has been compared, I think, to the sushi chefs in Japan who, for their first, if you're an apprentice for the first 3 or 4 years, you're not allowed to touch anything, you just watch.
Right.
You just watch the master at work, and then at some point, he gives you the tools, and then you
and apparently they're quite good.
Yeah, right.
Even though they've never done it. And
exactly.
doing it tactfully is actually helpful, but
I think that has interesting implications for education in general, both
I agree.
the sushi model and the chimpanzee model.
Franz wrote a book called Ape and the Sushi Master.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, so, he wrote a whole book about that concept of...
It's called The Ape and the Sushi.
The Ape and the Sushi Master. Yeah.
Who wrote this?
Franz Deval, the same.
He's got good titles.
Yeah, he comes up... Yeah, we should talk about that more too, but go ahead.
Yeah, so, I know as well in the wild, various groups of chimps have sort of gone about a task in different ways. So if it's cracking a nut, they'll find different ways to do it, and that will become sort of the culture of that particular group. If they use a rock to do it versus another group that does a different way.
Right.
And that also seems to be very much a cultural thing, a cultural transmission, in much the same way that human societies have variations of doing the same thing.
Variations of doing the same things, and primatologists have described it as, do you eat your food with a fork or do you use chopsticks? Well, it depends on where you're from. Or do you use your hands? In the wild, we see chimpanzees who have a suite of things available to them, and they go about procuring what they need on a day-to-day basis in ways that are different, even though they might have the same exact thing as the neighboring group. And they do. So do you crack open nuts with a rock, or do you use some sort of petrified wood? Do you fish for termites in a way that you're pulling out the optimal amount? Do you swipe them off with your finger and put them in the mouth with your hand, or do you just eat them directly off the reed? These are important things, and little things like that over time affect who got the most sustenance from their environment and who are more likely to reproduce and have more offspring into the next generation across an entire suite of animals. So how you go about doing something and what tools, literally what tools you use in order to accomplish your goals, to stay alive. I mean, that's human beings. We're from a long line of very successful ancestors who were able to get us to the point where we have all this awesome technology, and now this stuff, it's a little bit different now. I think how we have the things that we have access to. But there's a definite advantage there. It's a highly adaptive trait to be able to pass on these different cultural traditions. And whatever works if it works for your culture to do a certain thing a certain way, then great, stick with what works. But you also have innovators, just like we do. There'll be a chimpanzee innovator who, I don't know what the thought process is like in their mind, but they're like, oftentimes it's a female too. She'll say, I'm going to try this method a little differently. I don't know, I don't think she has that inner monologue, but it works, and they stick with it, and then you might see the other chimpanzees gathering around that. Or if a neighboring chimpanzees, the females emigrate, they leave their home group when they're about 10 years old. They show up to a new group of chimpanzees, and they kind of stay on the periphery for a while, so they don't get hurt, and then eventually, they're giant swelling, and whatever, and the males are like, well, okay, come on in to this group here. You can be part of this group. Males stay in their groups for life. What if she brings this suite of traits that this other group of chimps has never seen before? You can see them all gather around and watch, and then that information is passed, especially if youngsters watch her, is passed down to the next generation. So that's not so different from what we do with passing on cultural tradition. It really isn't.
So they respect the virtuoso in a sense, as we do, which I think is fascinating.